obviously Brexit is the big unknown at the moment, and the way the Council of Ministers has decided to deal with that approach is to table a bill that gives them the broadest possible set of powers, which I can understand that approach, I really can, but actually from my perspective, Parliament and Tynwald needs to have some overall control, the overall backstop, I think, over some of these powers, and the only way to really make sure that's effective is to build it into the legislation, because whilst the current Chief Minister and the current Council of Ministers can promise the earth and can make commitments, they can't actually bind the next Council of Ministers or the one after that or the one that comes after that, and that's the concern, is you put these powers down in law and that's it, then they're there, they exist.
Well, I think the idea of the bill, perhaps I've misunderstood it, is to give departments their own prerogative in deciding what happens. Specifically, we've heard the likes of DEFRA, because there'll be a whole load of changes, we imagine, to agriculture, and things like customs and excise too. Shouldn't they have jurisdiction over their own affairs?
In some respects, yes. It's only DEFRA in this bill, actually, that's handed specific powers. All the rest of the powers go to the Council of Ministers. In some ways, yes, and the secondary legislative process is there for a reason. It's there because sometimes you need things to be detailed, you need things to be simple, you need things to be quick. There's plenty of good reasons to use secondary legislation. There's also plenty of bad reasons to use secondary legislation, and sometimes my view is it's used for expediency's sake, so government will table something as secondary because it's quick and easy. That's how they get it through. It's a single sitting of Tynwald, just slam it down, and it will get approved, as the stats from the last 7 years show. Tynwald has a 100% success rate almost in passing secondary legislation. Whereas if you take it through the primary process, there's more scrutiny. You get to go through everything line by line to make sure it is exactly what you want. It isn't a complete take it or leave it process. So there's a bit more risk there for government, but equally there's a bit more parliamentary control, a bit more parliamentary input, a bit more scrutiny that goes on in the primary process. And so sometimes it's right to use primary bills. And the worry that I have with the EU bill as it's drafted is it doesn't really encourage that. The powers are so broad and there's no backstop in them that actually there's no reason you'd ever need to use a primary bill ever again. Some of those powers are that broad that you could basically pass this EU bill. You wouldn't need much other legislation in order to get all government business done. And I'm really glad in the Chief Minister, when he moved the bill, he did talk about looking to put backstop clauses in and some sunset or review dates, and I welcome that. That's a really great step forward.
5 years, though, is the next review. That's a long time.
It is, and I can accept why government needs a long backstop date. I mean,
we'll have a whole new administration by then.
We will. What was originally proposed when they were talking about similar kind of provisions in the UK with their EU bill was a date that was 2 years post-exit date, which would have given them enough time for transition. And I think the way we're going at the moment, we could have a 2-year transition period, a 2-year post-transition period. It could be. We've no idea where we are. So from my perspective, I think 5 years is quite a reasonable compromise for the Council of Ministers to have made.
Well, the Chief Minister's called for quick decisions to be made, and yes, I guess the Isle of Man's got to be reactive. I'm sure not many people would disagree with that. Do you think the power which you see as being concentrated on the Council of Ministers through this bill is about efficiency, or is it about something more?
No, because one of the comments that was made in the second reading debate by the Chief Minister was if we tried to do all of this through primary legislation, House of Keys would be deadlocked. And he's right, it would be. But no one's suggesting that. I think what we're suggesting, at least what I'm suggesting, is there should be a balance between what is brought forward as primary, which is the big, really important stuff you don't expect to change, and what is brought forward as secondary, which can be the smaller, more detailed, more technical, more complex bits and pieces. And the way the bill is structured at the moment, there is no reason for government to pick one or the other, and so the default position will be secondary. And that's kind of okay in the short term to get us through the Brexit process. I've got no issue with that because we do have to table so much stuff so quickly. But then you kind of want to think, well, hold on, longer term, what's right for the Isle of Man? And what's right longer term is to take stuff out of that secondary provision, that copy and paste approach that we have to take because of the deadlines we're under, and provide some proper scrutiny, look at everything in detail and say, actually, is this right for us? Do we need to make some changes? Do we want to improve it? Do we want to keep it all as it is? And that can only really be done effectively through the primary process.
So is too much power being focused on the Council of Ministers here?
In some respects, I think yes. The bill's powers are very broad as currently drafted. Like I say, I'm quite reassured by putting some backstop review dates in, which they don't actually limit the powers themselves, but what they end up doing is saying, well, this power only exists for the next 2 years, or this power only applies in certain circumstances, or at the very least, if you want to pass things under this power, that's great, but Tynwald has to reapprove it after a number of years. That I think is quite a sensible backstop, because whilst I accept personally that the Council of Ministers feels it needs a broad range of powers to get us through Brexit. I think what we need to be careful of is a future Council of Ministers using those same powers, perhaps for a different reason, a reason which they were maybe never intended to be used for. And that's why it's important to build these backstops, these checks and balances into the bill.
So is it setting perhaps a dangerous precedent?
That's my concern, actually, is that when you put these powers down in law, they can be used by any Council of Ministers from here until the end of time. And so when we're setting this law down, we have to be very careful what powers Parliament, Tynwald in this case, hands over to the executive branch. And I think sometimes that's lost, and sometimes the conversation you end up having is, well, this Council of Ministers is never going to do that. And I accept that, I could take that at face value. But actually, what about the next Council of Ministers, or the one in 10 years' time, or the one in 15 years' time? So unless we have something built into the bill as a check and balance, then you're relying entirely on Tynwald itself throwing out the secondary legislation it feels is inappropriate. And over the last 7 years, that just hasn't happened. And we've seen some laws passed which haven't been the right laws, which have then been brought back to be fixed, or which haven't been brought back to be fixed and still sit there on the statute books. And you can't really have that when you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with such a volume of legislation that Brexit is going to bring in. It's very important to make sure that we have appropriate checks, appropriate balances built into that primary bill.